right, good Shabbos, everyone. 2 weeks ago, I got back from a conference in Florida, and I landed at Hobby Airport. And you know that part of Hobby Airport where everyone walks out of the baggage claim. And there in the Uber area, where people can pick up from Lyft or Uber, all the private ride sharing, there must have been 200 people waiting for an Uber. I've never seen such a long line of people just waiting for their different Ubers. But then you looked over to the taxi line, and there was one taxi there, and the taxi driver was sitting on the back of his cab, smoking a cigarette. I think he had been there for half an hour. No one went up to the guy, except me. I felt bad for the guy, and I didn't want to wait an hour for my Uber. And it turned out it wasn't so bad. But who would have thought 15 years ago that we would actually get most of our rides when we land at places like airports from people driving private cars, not taxis, like we've been so used to for generations. And it's not just taxis and Ubers. Think about your cable TV. My children are in college and grad school now. When they were moving into their apartments, I said, "Do you want me to call the cable company?" They had no idea what I was talking about. Or they laughed at me. And my son, who lives in Dallas in his apartment while he's in grad school, pays a lot less money than I do for my cable TV. He doesn't have cable. He has all kinds of apps and whatever. He pays a lot less money and has a lot more channels than I do. And I would do what he did if I could ever figure out how to get rid of my cable. But who would have ever thought 15 years ago you wouldn't have to get cable, but you could get TV for a much better price through all kinds of different apps. Our children, our grandchildren will not know a world where there were taxis or where there is cable TV. Think about already when they see a payphone. They have no idea what that is. But there's one other institution, you could call it, that's been around for centuries. And that, of course, is the newspaper. My children won't even consider getting a newspaper. They never read the paper, but they read online. They get most of their news like most of our young people get it today, through TikTok, which is a whole other sermon in and of itself, Instagram, Facebook, you name it. They don't get their news from newspapers. But for years, until last week, I was steadfast. I was going to keep my subscription to the Houston Chronicle. Like many of you in this room, I love getting my newspaper, sitting down over coffee, reading the paper, catching up on what was happening here in Houston and throughout the world. And even though I've also got news online, there was just something very nice and authentic about holding the paper in my hand. But as the years went on and as the Chronicle got a lot smaller than it used to, with a lot less writers that I enjoyed and a lot less news, there was something over the last 5 months that finally put me over the edge and maybe to finally decide to get rid of the Houston Chronicle. And of course, that's Israel's war with Hamas. The headlines day after day about what was happening in Gaza finally put me over the edge. Now, like other guys in their 50s whose parents also have high blood pressure, I now have high blood pressure. But I think the Chronicle added to that high blood pressure. And every morning I would read headlines like this. And by the way, they weren't Chronicle reporters. Like, unfortunately, most newspapers throughout the country, there was no money to have their own reporters outside of Houston. They were all Associated Press headlines. And AP has a horrid history of how they cover the Middle East. Here's just an example of some of the headlines over the last several months. Israel's military campaign in Gaza seen as among the most destructive in recent history. Israel's military forces raid Gaza's largest hospital in what is claimed to be operation against Hamas. It's not just Israel bombs that have killed children in war-ravaged Gaza. Now some are dying of hunger too. Palestinians in Gaza begin Ramadan with hunger worsening and no end in sight to the war. Those are the headlines. Now, if you read the story, you may find something that's a little more balanced sometimes. But 9 out of 10 times I found in my own unscientific study was that the headlines were very inflammatory, to paint picture of Israel in a very bad light, to make normal Houstonians who know less about the conflict than you and I may know simply believe that Israel is in the wrong, simply believe that Israel could do no right. And if the headlines weren't bad enough and the news stories weren't one-sided enough, the editorials may have been even worse. Not just the editorials written by the Houston Chronicle editorial board, but the guest editorials that would appear from time to time. Every once in a while, you would see something written by someone who had more of a balanced approach. But again, I saw time after time, a majority of the editorials not only were biased against Israel, but uninformed, with incorrect information simply painted to make Israel look like it was the complete aggressor with no right to defend itself against Hamas terrorists, blaming Israel and only Israel for the tragic deaths we've seen in Gaza. And so I wasn't alone, of course. And back in December, the Federation invited me, along with a few other people, to meet with the editorial board of the Houston Chronicle. And so I was excited, the opportunity to share our side of the story, our concerns, ask him to try to paint a more balanced approach to Israel, a Western democracy fighting against a terrorist group. 20 years ago, it wouldn't have been necessary to have even this type of discussion. But in our day and age, it was. And so we went into that meeting with high hopes. Perhaps they would listen to our side, share our concerns, understand where we were coming from. But unfortunately, we found an editorial board that was defensive, that didn't want to hear what we had to say, that didn't believe that Israel had any right to do what it was doing, and felt that their editorials were painting a proper picture of what was happening in the Middle East. I left that meeting deflated and disappointed with the way in which the Houston Chronicle had become, a paper that I felt no longer showed a balanced approach to what was happening in this horrific war. And so while I still receive a daily email that focuses in on just sports and local news, I finally canceled my home delivery of the Houston Chronicle. And here's the good news. I'm saving $100 a month. My recycle bin on Wednesdays is much lighter. But I no longer, and number 3, I no longer have to worry about the paper every morning raising my blood pressure. Now, I want to support our local newspaper. I do think local newspapers have a purpose. And there are many fine writers of the Houston Chronicle, people in our own Jewish community who write for the Chronicle. There are good, talented people that care about this city, that care about our nation, and in their own way do care about this world. And I do think it's important as a democracy to have as many journalists out there reporting the news. But what would bring me back one day to renew my home subscription of the Houston Chronicle? Well, when I called to cancel my subscription, that's what they asked me. They said, we see you've been a member or getting the Houston Chronicle at home for the last 22 years. What would it take to bring you back? And I'll tell you what I told the person on the phone. I told them I want a paper, a local paper, that has balance, that has fairness, that there's nuance to the paper, not just one side of the story. I said to the person on the phone, let me see both sides of the story, and then I can decide what I want to believe. I'm not asking a newspaper like the Chronicle to paint only pro-Israel editorials or pro-Israel stories. Make it balanced. I can handle anti-Israel stories as long as from time to time I at least see pro-Israel stories, at least half the time. Let me decide. Give me a balanced newspaper, and then let me, as an educated, intelligent person, decide for myself what I believe is right. Isn't that what journalism was supposed to be about? Isn't that what newspapers were supposed to be about? Inform us of the facts, and then let you and I, intelligent people, people that care about this city, our country, in this world, decide then what we believe the news is. Don't force feed what your beliefs are through painting a picture of what they think Israel is behaving. Let me decide. Israel is too important right now. This war is too important right now. And papers do shape the opinion. Media does shape the opinion of the way in which this country is now talking to Israel. We see not only the protest out there in the streets, we see a rise in anti-Semitism, and I do believe that headlines in newspapers like the Chronicle do shape our personal safety here in America. And so I hope and pray the newspapers like the Chronicle will understand the reason why their subscription rates have decreased so dramatically over the last couple decades isn't just because we can get free news online. It's because, like too much media in this country, they descended into ideological activism. They want us to believe what they believe instead of informing us of the news and letting us decide what we believe. My friends, in this day and age, there are too many other sources out there that are impartial. That's how I like to search the news every morning. I read the New York Times online and the Wall Street Journal. I watch Fox News and I watch MSNBC. I read the Free Press. I've subscribed to Barry Weiss. I listen to podcasts from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. I like to inform myself of what's happening. I don't need people deciding for me what to believe. And if you share some of my frustrations, I invite you to also contact the Houston Chronicle, even if you've already given up your subscription as well. Let them know how we feel, because until they hear from more pro-Israel people in our community, people that are asking for at least some balance, some nuance, some fairness, they're not going to change. They need to hear from us as well. I want a local newspaper, and I think you do as well, one that can inform us of what's happening so we can decide for ourselves. And nothing will change unless we too share our concerns. Shabbat shalom, everyone.